You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is July 30th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now in print and now available on the International Publisher's website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, first want to ask you about the latest updates on U.S.'s trade war. First, it was reported Monday, July 28th, that the United States and the European Union finalized what President Trump called, quote, the largest trade deal in history, with Europe committing $600 billion in U.S. investments and $750 billion in energy purchases, although analysts suggest the EU may have conceded even more ground than has yet reached the news. And on July 23rd, it was announced that the U.S. reached a trade deal with Japan that will impose 15% tariffs on imports, including automobiles from Japan. And the U.S. deal with Japan includes a $550 billion fund whereby Japan is to make investments in the U.S., with Japan agreeing to provide the funds to invest in projects in the U.S. Lastly, the European Union and China held their 25th summit in Beijing on July 24th. The President of the European Council, Antonio Costa, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, met with China's President, Xi Jinping, followed by a meeting with Premier Li Qiang. Analysts have framed this meeting as a disaster as the EU was humiliated. But Dr. Horne, how should we be analyzing all of these recent events?
Well, the short answer is that this may represent imperialism's last stand. That, on the one hand, is fantastic news, but from the point of view of those of us who will shortly be in the United States of America, it's rather sobering, because if the ruling class is not able to flex its muscles sufficiently abroad because of the rise of China, the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they'll be predisposed to take more out of our hides, which obviously is quite unfortunate. It reminds me of the metaphor you oftentimes see today in 2025, making reference to events in the 19th century when settler colonialism in North America was accelerating. That is to say, as they proceeded across the continent in their covered wagons, the settlers oftentimes were attacked by the indigenous people since they were invading their land. And the metaphor and the actuality was that the settlers would circle the wagons so that they could better defend themselves against those who were attacking them. And I think the import of this so-called trade deal with the European Union in particular, it represents circling the wagons. That is to say, it's difficult to explain the capitulation of Brussels otherwise. It's difficult to explain why the French Prime Minister spoke of a dark day in Scotland as a result of the EU, the European Union, which includes France, signing on the dotted line. He also said it represented, quote, submission, unquote. There was similar discontent expressed by German industry, particularly the automobile industry, for example. And it's difficult to explain this submission, to use the word of Prime Minister Bayrou of France, without understanding that the United States and European Union feel challenged and threatened by China in particular, and as we shall note shortly, by Russia as well. That is to say that this idea that the European Union will spend $750 billion on U.S. energy, which according to credible press reports, they don't have the capacity to absorb that much in terms of natural gas and fossil fuels, for example. But certainly it represents the inevitable result of steering clear of cheap energy from Russia, which left the European Union with little alternative but to purchase expensive energy from the United States of America. Likewise, the fact that the European Union is saying that it will spend billions of dollars with regard to weapons from the U.S. military industrial complex, obviously these weapons will be pointed at Russia, and there lies the not so hidden agenda of this deal. That is to say that it's a kind of bribe to U.S. imperialism, so that U.S. imperialism will continue to support the Western European nations with regard to their failed escapade in Ukraine. And it seems as well that there is a possibility that this tightened relationship between Brussels and Washington can also be turned militarily against the People's Republic of China. You should not see it as accidental or coincidental that shortly after this deal was inked, Mr. Trump started speaking in much tougher terms towards Russia. Recall that just the other day, he said that Russia now has about 10 days to wrap up this conflict in Ukraine, whereas a week or two ago, it was 50 days. I think that one does not have to be a soothsayer to divine the point that Mr. Trump is satisfied with this capitulation from the Europeans, and therefore he is more inclined to go all in with regard to Ukraine. And in order to understand why Europe would submit so brazenly to Washington's demands, you also, as we have said numerous times in the past, have to understand the troubled history between Russia on the one hand and the Western European states on the other, the latter getting fat on the slave trade and pillaging of the Americas, whereas Russia was still the preeminent power in their backyard, leading to Napoleon invading Russia 200 years ago, leading to the Crimea War of the 1850s, whereby France and Britain and Ottoman Turkey gang up on Russia. Fast forwarding to Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi attack on Russia, not to mention the entire Cold War. But the problem that the imperialists face is that despite these kinds of capitulations and submissions, they still have not indicated that they have an answer for the rise of the People's Republic of China. And so, to the extent that China sees Russia as its firewall, it will continue to support Russia with regard to Ukraine. Likewise, Russia will continue to receive support from Iran, North Korea, and a good deal of the global South. And there are few better illustrations of the dilemma that the imperialist powers face than an issue in the July 21st edition of the weekly magazine, The New Yorker, which focuses heavily upon the military deficits of the imperialist countries, particularly with regard to drone warfare, which in many ways is revolutionizing battlefield tactics, which we see on a daily basis in Ukraine. And so despite bending the knee to Mr. Trump, Ursula von der Leyen has quite a dilemma to deal with, because even though press reports tend to suggest that the 27 member strong European Union member states, their parliaments will ratify this deal, I'm not so sure about that. And if this deal is not ratified by the parliaments, it's back to the drawing board. And all it really means is a deepening crisis, an ever deepening crisis for world imperialism, US imperialism in the first instance.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also wanted to put several stories together and get your reaction. First, on July 26th, it was reported in the Associated Press that there's a growing wave of, quote, reverse migration of Black Americans to the African continent, and their story highlighted Kenya as an example of a site for relocation. On the other side of the ledger is the news that the U.S. is trying to convert the African continent into a prison. As we have discussed in recent weeks, the U.S. has deported 5 people whom it described as, quote, criminal illegal aliens to Eswatini, Swaziland. The deportees are originally from Vietnam, Jamaica, Laos, Cuba, and Yemen. Similar deportations had recently been made to South Sudan, and discussions with other countries, such as Rwanda and Benin, have been ongoing. And before we turn the mic over, something we read in your most recent book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865, seems relevant to what we are seeing today in the 21st century. On page 19 of the book, you explain how at the beginning of the 19th century, the authorities in the U.S. were, quote, complaining that great mischiefs have arisen from slaves coming into possession of the certificates of free Negroes by running away and passing as free, inducing a crackdown on both statuses of Africans, a dangerously repetitive pattern in the slaveholders' republic. Dr. Horne, do you see any repetitive patterns between the practices of the slaveholders' republic today with those practices outlined in your most recent book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865?
I certainly see a repetitive pattern. And in fact, if you look at that Associated Press article that's referenced, you'll see a repetitive theme. That is to say, one of the many reasons that you have so many Black Americans moving to Nairobi in particular is because of the atrocious treatment that Black people are subjected to here in the United States of America, the land of their birth. This is a direct result of the fact that the revolt against British rule in 1776 was executed in no small measure to continue the enslavement of Africans. And therefore, you had class struggle imbued in Africans, that is to say, resisting the status quo up to and including uprisings, which I talk about at length in the book reference, malingering and resistance of all sorts. And that kind of opposition to the status quo has been descended to this very day, leading precisely to that kind of atrocious treatment. And it's not only moving to Nairobi. For some years now, you've had a stream, if not a flood, of Black Americans moving to Ghana in West Africa, to Tanzania in Southeast Africa. In fact, Pete O'Neill, a former leader of the Black Panther Party in Kansas City, has been in Southeast Africa and Tanzania for decades now. Since South African independence in 1994, you've had a flood of Black Americans moving to the southern cone of the continent, not only to South Africa itself, but also to Namibia and Zimbabwe. And I dare say that this trend will probably accelerate in the next few years as Trumpism digs its claws into the flesh of so many of our brothers and sisters. And likewise, I'm afraid to say as well, that this incipient trend of sending undocumented workers to various sites in Africa, to Djibouti in East Africa, to South Sudan, to East Swatini, formerly known as Swaziland, that trend too will continue, because I feel and I think that there might be some sort of bribe involved. Certainly there has been a bribe involved in terms of sending undocumented workers to El Salvador. So this is a dual trend. A trend on the one hand that's worthy of support, that is to say, self-exile in Nairobi, in Ghana, in Southern Africa, and a trend that should be resisted with all our might, that is to say, sending undocumented workers to South Sudan, to Eswatini, to Djibouti, because keep in mind that Mr. Trump and his minions have made clear that even though undocumented workers are first in line to be deported unceremoniously, the so-called homegrowns, to use Mr. Trump's term, that is to say, those of us who were born in the United States of America, who carry U.S. passports, either because of being born here or becoming naturalized, we're number 2 on that list. So it's in our self-interest to protest while there's still an opportunity to do so.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, We also want to ask you about several news items related to South Africa. First, on July 22nd, U.S. lawmakers voted to advance a bill that proposes reviewing the U.S. relationship with South Africa due to objections over its foreign policy and potentially imposing sanctions on South African officials. This bill is a step further and underscores tensions between Washington and Pretoria as South Africa seeks to fend off a looming 30% U.S. tariff and counter false claims of white genocide made by President Trump. In addition, U.S. Congressman Ronnie Jackson of Texas exclaimed in support of the bill that, quote, South Africa made its choice when they abandoned America and our allies and sided with communists and terrorists. Lastly, this past weekend in South Africa, individuals and political organizations attended the Liberation Movement's summit in South Africa with the hope that their leaders in the region will have honest, frank, and robust discussions about the challenges their countries face. The summit was convened under the theme, Defending the Liberation Gains, Advancing Integrated Socio-Economic Development, Strengthening Solidarity for a Better Africa. The summit was organized by the ANC with leaders of Frelimo, SWAPO, ZANU-PF, and the MPLA in attendance. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of all of these important news items related to South Africa?
Well, first of all, we need to realize that this attack on South Africa is part and parcel of Mr. Trump's attack on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. We've just made reference to the attempt to undermine Russia and China. Just today, it was announced that tariffs will be hiked in a spectacular fashion against not only Brazil, but against India, which is quite remarkable in light of the fact that U.S. imperialism feels that it can manipulate India against its BRICS partners, speaking of China. The other point is that with regard to the meeting of the former liberation movements taking place under the aegis of the African National Congress, our audience, I'm sure, recognizes that the United States was a hostile opponent of these liberation movements before they came to power. Recall that Mr. Nelson Mandela not only was in prison for 27 years, but he was likely in prison as a result of a tip from a U.S. CIA agent in South Africa, a tip to the apartheid authorities. We know that U.S. imperialism has had sanctions against Zimbabwe for years now because of Zimbabwe's attempt to engage in land reform. And even though Mr. Biden, one of his final trips was to Angola, that is to say, to curry favor with the MPLA, the liberation movement formerly now the ruling party in Luanda, it was no secret that that was part of an attempt to put pressure on Luanda to turn against South Africa. And speaking of South Africa, it's not only their membership in the BRICS, it's their dragging U.S. ally Israel before the dock in terms of the International Court of Justice, making out a plausible case for genocide. It's about baby steps towards land reform in South Africa, which has outraged Mr. Trump and many of his South African-born advisors. Not only Elon Musk, but David Sachs, the crypto AI czar. Not only David Sachs, but Peter Thiel, an early bankroller of Mr. Trump. And not to mention Roland Botha, a lineal descendant of the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa, who is now a leading venture capitalist, if not the leading venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. So there's a gang up against South Africa. And I'm sure many of our audience might find this curious because I'm sure many of our audience have not been enthused by some of the policies pursued by the ANC. But what needs to be recognized is that Washington would like to see its comrades in power. That's one of the striking aspects of the foreign policy of U.S. imperialism. It does not matter, at least with regard to many African states, how much you try to conciliate U.S. imperialism. The bottom line is that they would prefer to see their comrades in power. And what we're going to have to avoid going forward is playing into that somehow by not acknowledging that rather bitter and brutal reality.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the Philippines. On July 14th, tensions in the Philippines have recently been raised over the country's South China Sea policy, after Romeo Pocahis, a retired Air Force general, criticized Manila's current approach as making the country a, quote, U.S. pawn, and even another Ukraine, in its geopolitical power struggle with China. Pocahis also claimed that almost a decade on, the Philippines has found itself at the center of a power play between the U.S. and China. Pocahis said, quote, fighting China serves U.S. interests more than our own. It's not strategy. It's provocation. We are being turned into a launch pad for someone else's missiles, an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Indo-Pacific. We need leaders who think long-term, who can defend sovereignty without turning Filipinos into cannon fodder, end quote. Pocahis' remarks were, of course, rejected by the Philippines Armed Forces, but apparently were widely supported by most Filipinos. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to retired Air Force General Pocahis' statement? It seems like he may be on to something, does it not?
On to something indeed. You may recall that just a few days ago, the man we refer to as Bongbong Marcos, the president of this archipelago, speaking of the Philippines, was in the Oval Office pledging fealty to U.S. imperialism. But his pledging fealty did not obscure the fact that his vice president, and by the way, they ran on separate tickets, speaking of Sara Duterte, is hotly opposed to Mr. Marcos's suck-up to U.S. imperialism. Recall that it was her father, the elder Duterte, who was in power before Bongbong, and one of the first and most important and profound acts executed by Mr. Marcos was to bundle off Mr. Duterte to The Hague to stand trial for alleged human rights violations. Now, this represents a split in terms of the approach to foreign policy. Since Mr. Duterte was known to be interested in cuddling up to Beijing, and Bongbong has taken the opposing position. But given the fact that the elite in the Philippines is disproportionately comprised of those of Chinese ancestry, given the proximity of China to the Philippines and its ability to uplift poverty-stricken Filipinos, just like it uplifted poverty-stricken Chinese, Mr. Bongbong Marcos, in the long term, is pursuing a very short-sighted policy. But to take a broader historical view, if you go back to 1898, when the United States invaded the Philippines as the Spanish colonizers who had been occupying the archipelago for centuries were in the process of being ousted, not unlike the process that was unfolding simultaneously in Cuba across the planet, you saw that U.S. imperialism engaged in a bitter, brutal, bloody war against the Filipino guerrilla forces, the Filipino patriotic forces. This war lurched on for decades and perhaps was only interrupted by World War II and the fact that as of December 1941, you had a Japanese imperial invasion of the Philippines, which lasted virtually until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, which of course then led to a kind of independence for the Philippines in the following year. And of course, the squashing or the attempted squashing of the Filipino left, because I should point out that since the U.S. invasion of 1898, intermittently, there has been guerrilla armies in the Philippines that persist to this very day. And so Mr. Trump might be counting his chickens before they're hatched when he ratifies this deal with Bongbong Marcos, because I dare say that Mr. Marcos may not be in power much longer, either forced out because of the rise of Sara Duterte or forced out because of the continued strength of these aforementioned left-wing forces.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about several stories related to Palestine. First, this past Monday, July 28th, Saudi Arabia and France opened a 3-day conference at the United Nations with the goal of recognizing Palestinian statehood as an alleged effort to encourage a peaceful settlement to end Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. The conference began this Monday, just days after the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said Paris would officially recognize the Palestinian government in September. And in stark contrast, on July 22nd, U.S. Congressman Randy Fine of Texas said on his official congressional account on X that Palestinians in Gaza should starve away, while also claiming the reports of people dying of hunger due to the U.S.-backed Israeli blockade are, quote, a lie. Congressman Fine made these vile comments in response to the reports that 15 Palestinians, including 4 children, had died of starvation in the previous 24 hours. Congressman Fine went on to write, quote, release the hostages. Until then, starve away. This is all a lie anyway. It amazes me that the media continues to regurgitate Muslim terror propaganda. End quote. In addition, on July 26, the Freedom Flotilla Coalition confirmed that its civilian vessel Handala, en route to break Israel's illegal, genocidal blockade on Palestinians in Gaza, was violently intercepted by the Israeli military in international waters about 40 nautical miles from Gaza. The Handala carried 21 civilians representing 12 countries, including parliamentarians, lawyers, journalists, labor organizers, environmentalists, and other human rights defenders. The unarmed boat was carrying life-saving supplies when it was boarded by Israeli forces, its passengers abducted, and its cargo seized. The interception occurred in international waters outside Palestinian territorial waters off Gaza, in violation of international maritime law. The Handala carried a shipment of critical humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza, including baby formula, diapers, food, and medicine for a population facing deliberate starvation and medical collapse under Israel's illegal blockade. Lastly, this past Monday, July 28th, Yemen announced Phase 4 of the Israeli naval blockade. Yemen warned global shipping firms to cut ties with Israel or face military retaliation, citing support for Palestinians amid Gaza's deepening humanitarian crisis and famine. Yemen stressed that ships belonging to violating companies will be targeted wherever Yemeni missiles and drones can reach, regardless of their destination. And Yemeni authorities added that if countries wish to avoid further escalation, they must pressure the Israel to end its aggression and lift the siege on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Dr. Horne, once again, we put a lot on the table. But what is your reaction to all of these stories related to Palestine?
Well, it represents what we began talking about, that is to say, the crisis of world imperialism, this time centered in historic Palestine, because it's not only France, which has broken ranks with U.S. imperialism with regard to this conference at the United Nations. They were followed by Great Britain, and even though Great Britain has said it too, given certain conditions, will recognize Palestinian statehood in September, and it has been criticized for being performative, the fact is that apparently that maneuver was accompanied by Britain ceasing intelligence sharing with regard to flights from its base in Cyprus over historic Palestine, with the intelligence then reporting back to Mr. Netanyahu and the Mossad, Israeli intelligence. Likewise, Canada, which is coming closer to the European Union, and particularly to France, and moving away from U.S. imperialism, has followed in the footsteps of Britain and France with regard to this qualified recognition of Palestinian statehood by September. Now, on the one hand, of course, this proposal for qualified statehood, it begs the question, to put it mildly, of will this state that they recognize, will it have contiguity? That is to say, will it be a kind of Swiss cheese type state with portions of the territory carved out for the 700,000 illegal Israeli settlers on the West Bank, for example? What will happen with regard to the millions of Palestinians now in exile? Will they be allowed to return, for example? And likewise, with regard to how Britain, France, and Canada are, at least in an official sense, on the other side of the fence from U.S. imperialism with regard to this qualified recognition, even within the Republican Party. You mentioned Congressman Fine and his obnoxious remarks, but we should not ignore that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene just the other day used the G word, genocide, with regard to what's going on in Palestine. And if I'm not mistaken, even a person as eminent as Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont has to this point not used the G word, the genocide word. Now, that reflects fragmentation within the MAGA base, something that we're going to have to play upon. I should also mention that with regard to the flotilla, happily in the ranks of those seeking to bring aid to historic Palestine was the rank and file leader of Amazon workers, speaking of Chris Smalls. And sadly and tragically, it seemed as if the authorities singled him out for special persecution and handling. They must have thought that they were enacting the script from the United States of America, because after all, Mr. Smalls is of African descent, and it's no secret that there's a special animus towards that particular minority. But in any case, I think that Israel is going to have to do some deep thinking with regard to its current policy, because with the crisis of U.S. imperialism on the one hand and the fragmentation of junior imperialist powers on the other, speaking of Britain, France, and Canada, and the fact that the BRICS nations, generally speaking, are standing tall with regard to Palestine, not to mention the global South as represented by our Yemeni friends, the Israelis are really headed for an iceberg. But I'm not sure if they are sensitive and intelligent enough to recognize that. But alas, we have reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.